My name is Adam Wong, Lead Instructor for Cyber Operations. Here at BWSI Summer Institute Cyber Operations, we select, train, advise, and counsel students to become technically proficient analysts in both skills and methodologies. Cyber Operations is structured to incorporate and collaborate with industry experts from the field so that varying perspectives contribute to our world-class education. Students are introduced to a battery of instruction ranging from network administration, defensive cyber operations, digital forensics, intelligence analysis, and offensive security. Students are expected to operate in teams during the high-stress scenario in order to analyze evidence, execute simulated missions together, lead their peers by example, as well as to build out their cohort. And now, I'm proud to announce their capstone exercise. At stage 1, students will analyze large data sets of network traffic. They'll be asked to identify unusual activity, conduct research, and validate their suspicions. At stage 2, they must analyze and identify unknown malware samples while extracting indicators of compromise, and they must be prepared to assess the behaviors of the malware and provide a high-level overview. At stage 3, they'll generate VR rules for both the malware samples as well as Suricata rules for the malware command and control activities. They must be prepared to conduct open-source research to validate their findings or provide situational awareness to leadership. Students will also work to identify possible groups responsible for the malware. At stage 4, they must provide their exit reporting and presentation to instructors and the BWSI community. Again, we are Cyber Operations, protect, detect, respond.
Hi all, and welcome to the Cyber Operations Class 2022 capstone presentation. My name is Malcolm, and I'll be starting off. This is our class logo. For the first part of the course, we were broken up into these 5 teams shown here as we work through training exercises. In the second part of the course, we moved more towards this larger capstone project. The roadmap for this capstone presentation is as follows. We start off with an introduction phase, then we'll move into stage 1's PCAP investigation, stage 2's malware analysis, then stage 2B's memory dump, stage 3's open source intelligence, and we'll summarize with a conclusion and lessons learned from the course, and we'll end with a question and answer section. In between each stage, we'll have a technical Q&A where you can ask technical questions and get those answered.
So before we get into the specific stages, we'd like to offer a disclaimer that all the artifacts in this brief were previously analyzed by the cybersecurity community. This training data is publicly available. So first off, what exactly is cyber operations? So cyber operations is a usage of cyberspace capabilities where the primary purpose is to achieve a goal in or via cyberspace. And a cyberspace capability is just a device or computer program that is designed to create an effect in or through cyberspace. So cyber operations covers a large scope of cybersecurities, and there are 2 main types of operations. There's offensive cyber operations and defensive cyber operations.
As Ella mentioned, there are offensive and defensive side of operations, which are usually split up into these 2 teams, which is the red team and the blue team. The red team consists of offensive cyber operations, which includes jobs such as penetration testing, which is checking for weaknesses in infrastructure, and other jobs. The blue team is the defensive side of cyber operations, which works on defensive security, analyzing network information, building firewall rules, doing malware analysis and memory forensics, and also OSINT, which is open source intelligence. For this capstone, we specialize in the blue team, which is the defensive side, and we were split up into 4 teams, making up 3 stages. The first stage, which perform PCAP analysis, or also called packet capture analysis, basically analyze the data which was pulled off of a compromised network. Stage 2A did malware analysis, where they categorized unknown sample of malware from files, and Stage 2B performed memory forensics, where they analyzed the memory dump from an infected machine. And finally, Stage 3 performed open source intelligence, where they pulled data from Stage 2A's research and then tried to establish information about the threat and different information.
Hello, my name is Veronica, and first we will talk about the PCAP investigation. So the background knowledge, what is a PCAP file and what would you use to open it? A PCAP file extension is mainly associated with Wireshark, and it's used in analyzing the network characteristics of a certain data. We will explain the process. We first partition the main PCAP file into 10 smaller files using editcap. Then we inspected each file in Wireshark and filtered by the HTTP protocol and discovered 4 malicious IP addresses. Lastly, we inspected all the requests these IP addresses made by various protocols like SSH, DNS, IRP, ICMP to gather more information. So we named the first IP address Pet Actor A. He attempted to exploit the web server 150.204.83.102. He also tried to exhaust the resources of the GET function, which can cause the web server to lower the security temporarily if successful, but the web server couldn't process the request because it was a client error. Then he also attempted to access the password.txt file. If accessed, the bad actor A may have access to user and admin accounts, but again, the access was denied. He also attempted to get access to the information of the manager server, so the administrator's information, and try to update a Metasploit text file. Bad actor A attempted to get information using a possibly stolen user ID and tried to get the W3DLL scripts, which allows remote attackers to cause a denial of service and possibly execute arbitrary code via long query string. But the server was set up properly and managed to deny the access.
Yeah, for bad actor B, oh hi, I'm Alexander, by the way. They tried to connect to this web server over HTTP. After they connected initially, they sent a bunch of these SYN packets, which are basically just saying, hi, how are you? So they sent so many of this, actually blocked traffic from legitimate users. Okay. And then the second attempt of an attack was trying to access a MySQL database. It tried to log in with the user Nessus, and it was actually denied. As you can see in the violet shaded packets, it got the response error, which is most likely due to a version mismatch.
Hi, my name is Shreya. One of the first things that we noticed about bad actor C was that they did an HTTP GET request for Nagios 3. So some context, Nagios 3 is a network monitoring application that I believe just came out a few days prior to this attack. So we believe that bad actor C could have used this application to further their attack, maybe look at open ports, see what traffic they could have been causing if this was like a DOS attack. And though this by itself isn't malicious, it is just suspicious and one thing to add.
And then bad actor C also accessed exploits.org. And the registrar of exploits.org is a company that was involved in a legal case. And although this legal case was unrelated to our specific case, being involved in a high-level legal case was an indicator that gave us more suspicion.
Hi, my name is Brian, and for the fourth suspected attacker, we've labeled that as bad actor D. For much of the traffic relating to bad actor D was SMB traffic. So for context, SMB stands for server message block. It's a file server protocol that allows users to access files on remote hosts. And what we found interesting was when we use the Wireshark tool that analyzes packet captures and followed the TCP stream, we noticed something that looked like credentials or usernames that are now highlighted in the boxes. And what was interesting was that among the traffic, that username differed all the time. So there were several thousand different usernames. And what we believe this is is a repeated or brute force authentication, because you need to first have authentication. You need to authenticate in order to access those files stored on a remote server. But if that is not the case, we have an alternative possibility. We believe if this is not a brute force authentication, this could also be a DOS attack using SMB traffic. And for context, DOS or denial of service is basically an attack where a malicious user tries to overwhelm a server with unimportant information or unimportant data to try to prevent the server from processing legitimate traffic. So we believe if it's not the case of authentication, then it could be a DOS attack for SMB.
Additionally, bad actor D also tried to exploit a few different web servers over DNS. So DNS is the domain name system. And what it does is it translates like a domain name, like google.com, into an IP address, okay? So we saw some suspicious traffic where it was repeatedly asking this web server for this website, c.icq.com. So it kept asking for this website over and over, and it wasn't getting any response. And we go to the next slide. I can, we see ICQ here. It was one of the first instant messengers. Okay, that was pretty cool in the late 90s. And then it was later acquired by a Russian company in early 2010. And this traffic was actually captured on March 11th, 2010. But there's no correlation, no clear correlation between the two. What's suspicious about this traffic is the severity level. Yep. And then you can go on to the next slide, and we see more DNS traffic. This is actually to a different IP address. We believe this is a DOS attack, like Brian previously mentioned, denial of service. It's actually getting a response here, but the reason why this traffic is very suspicious is it keeps asking for the same name. And the web servers respond with saying, we don't have that name. But it asks us actually thousands of times throughout the entire PCAP. And with that, that's all for stage 1 PCAP investigation. Do we have any questions?
Hi, my name is Roy, and I'll be introducing you to the malware analysis portion of our dataset. So to begin, malware analysis is basically the process of how we identify and understand how a piece of malware works. So in this case, we mainly use a toolkit called Remnux, which is an Ubuntu-based distribution of Linux, and it contains many pre-installed tools that help us find clues as to what a piece of malware might be doing underneath the surface. And this toolkit also involves the heavy use of the command line, and it displays much of its information from within a terminal. So we first started with a zip dataset labeled stx2a avalanche.zip, and that contained 2 layers of compression, so then we had to run 2 unzip commands. We used a tool called 7zip to help us unzip the files, and then we can work with the uncompressed versions. So if you look over at the first bullet, sudo apt-get installs p7zip-full, this actually installs the 7zip package, which will help us run the commands. And in the second bullet, we basically unzip the first layer of compression by running the unzip command, which is already pre-installed, and we pass in a password with the capital P option, and we pass in a file name. And as you can see on the right image, the displayed zip files from the second layer of compression from the first zip file are displayed in red. And then after that, we also ran the 7zip command using 7zx, pass in the password, and then pass in the target zip file. So after unzipping the second layer of compression, we have these results. So as you can see, the zip files which are in red have been uncompressed to their uncompressed contents, which were 0324.utc.eml, which is the email file from the emails.zip file. We have a directory which contains many different characters, which also contains 3 different sample bin files. And then from the same artifacts as zip file, we have 2 more sample bin files, and then we also have a packet capture.zip file, which basically unzips the activity.pcap file.
Hi, my name is Daniel, and I'll be describing some of the analysis we did on the 3 bin files mentioned previously. So first, we ran strings on each of the bin files to get the debug file paths. And we ran this through Joe Sandbox, which analyzed them and told us that these bin files are mainly evaders, spyware, and Trojans. Next slide. So we wanted to dive deeper into each of these categories and detect exactly what is giving this malware these properties. So we used tools such as PFrame, Kappa, and RipMine to test evasion, manalyze and hash lookup for testing Trojan properties, and Wireshark for spyware. Next slide. So we first looked at each of the bin files and ran the file command, which told us that these are portable executable, or P files, for Windows. And we decided to use PFrame, which is a tool integrated with Remnux, to analyze these bin files. And we got these results, which told us that each of the bin files have anti-debug properties, which support the previous Joe Sandbox hit that they are evaders. Next slide. And we also decided to use Kappa because Kappa is also a static tool to analyze P files. And Kappa gave us these results shown, which support the conclusion that the malware is evaders as well as spyware, as you can see with the discovery. And we also used manalyze to also statically analyze these bin files. And the results show us that these bin files are trying to pose as legitimate files from Mozilla Thunderbird specifically, which determines that these bin files are Trojans.
Hi, I'm Maria, and I'll be explaining further analysis on the technical artifacts that we were given. So another one of the artifacts that we were given for this project was an email to extract information from. And what we did first was move to the directory where the email zip file was extracted. Then we used RipMime on the email message file to extract its information. RipMime is essentially a tool used to extract attachments and information from email files. After using RipMime, we got all of these attachments from the email. And when we unzipped the remaining zip attachment, we extracted this HTA file. In the HTA file attachment, there's poorly obfuscated VVS script. After deobfuscating the script, we determined that it calls a URL to fetch and then execute a binary through PowerShell. The script then sets up some additional registry keys to the current user. Additional keys are for accessing Windows registry where internal settings are stated. If one registry key gets disabled, the malware can access another registry key. What the keys are doing is basically running the malware every time the user logs in. Hashes are digital fingerprints produced by a one-way function. It's basically data squeezed into a unique value, like strings of a fixed length. These are some common hashing algorithms like MD5. So since this data is encoded into a unique value, if the contents of a file are modified in any way, the hash of a file will change. Hashes can be used for searching for an existing file on the web or to check if a file has been manipulated. So we used a command called md5sum to get the hashes of the bin files and the HTA file. As you can see here, sample2 bin and the HTA file both have the same hash.
And my name is Ethan. Our next step was to use VirusTotal on the malware files. VirusTotal is an open source online tool which scans files for malicious properties using multiple antivirus scanners. In this case, we used MD5 hashes to search for the email file and the sample2 bin file. Of the 59 antivirus vendors, about half identified both files as malicious. As expected, most antivirus scanners identified the files as Trojans and even BBS agents. On the next slide, we used another tool called AnyRun on the email file, using the MD5 hash once again. And the way we're using it, AnyRun is very similar to VirusTotal, but it's a bit more specific in terms of the type of Trojan. AnyRun identified the email file as Raccoon Stealer. Raccoon Stealer is a malware as a service, meaning that it is sold illegally for anyone who wants it. Essentially, it steals data from the target machine like passwords, web browser credentials, and other personal information. More on that later. After that, we used Wireshark to look at the PCAP file associated with the interaction between the attacker and the target. In the bluish box at the top, you can see DNS queries being sent from the infected machine for the URL highlighted in the black box. This URL happens to be the same one from the script a few slides back and leads to malicious binary code that is then downloaded onto the machine. The infected machine then made another DNS query to a URL, which is the command and control URL for Raccoon Stealer. In the green box, you can see HTTP GET and POST requests sent from the target to the malicious IP address. This is evidence that there was a transfer of personal data from the infected machine to the attacker's machine.
Hi, I'm Grace. In summary, the malware we looked at acted as a Trojan by posing as legitimate Mozilla files, as an evader by obfuscating files, preventing the use of a debugger, and also creating multiple registry keys for backup access. Additionally, it acted as a spyware by transferring data to malicious IPs. These characteristics are similar to that of Raccoon Stealer, which is also a Trojan evader and spyware combo. Additionally, it shared binary strings with Raccoon Stealer, and IP addresses and domains associated with Raccoon Stealer were found in the packet capture. Knowing all of this, we can use Yara rules, on the next slide, to look for this malware and other files. Yara rules evaluate files for malware based on their binary strings. We can declare string variables that can use regular expression or regex, and evaluate conditions based on those string variables. On the next slide, we can see an example of a Yara rule for Raccoon Stealer. So we pulled malware file strings that describe file paths used by the malware files, and we set them as our string variables. And in the condition section, if either of the three variables show up, it will trigger the rule. And now we will move on to our question.
We actually do have quite a few questions from the audience. We have 4 questions so far. The first one is, what is a Trojan?
Sorry, I'm Malcolm. I talked earlier. A Trojan is a virus that disguises itself as a legitimate program. For example, this one, or Raccoon Stealer, as we saw, acted as a Trojan because it disguised itself as Mozilla files.
Great. Someone else would like to know how you knew to use RipMine?
So partially we were, throughout our progress through this course, introduced to various tools and provided with resources on many tools that are used in situations like malware analysis. So specifically, RipMine was one of the tools that we had learned about in this way, but we also were able to do additional research on which types of tools are often used for malware analysis for these certain types of files, such as an email file.
Awesome. Our next question was, how do you know if a file was manipulated through a hash?
So a hash is unique to each individual file. So the unique combination of bits of the file makes up that hash. So if you were to change a single bit in a file, the hash would be dramatically different than what it was previously. As a result, if you take a file where it's untampered with and you take the hash, and then someone were to tamper with that file, and then you were to take the hash of that tampered file, the two hashes would be different, and from that you could tell that there was tampering.
All right, great. And the last question was about how a team would decide which tools would be used for analysis. Were there a standard set of tools that were tried and always used, or is it based specifically on the behavior observed?
I forgot to introduce myself earlier, so my name is Sam. For that question specifically, it was more of a combination of both approaches because in terms of using sandbox tools like AnyRun or Joe Sandbox or VirusTotal, that was more of using that as a standard set that can be referenced to examine briefly and in a static way see if there's anything wrong with those files. But we also did analysis and choosing of tools based on the behaviors we saw. For example, when we looked at the sample bin files and saw that we ran the file command and saw that there were PE executables, we continued to do research on the types of tools that can be used to analyze PE executable files. And from there, we were able to find more of those commands and tools which we later use, such as PE frame and kappa.
Awesome, thank you guys. I think that's all the questions for now if you want to continue.
Hey, I'm Nicholas. So for memory analysis, we were given a memory dump from an infected machine and we analyzed it to identify the malware. The memory sample we were given was of the computer's volatile memory, which is memory stored in RAM. Volatile memory is lost when the machine is shut down. And to analyze the memory sample, we used Volatility, which is an open source program designed specifically for volatile memory analysis. So the first step in analyzing a memory dump is to identify the profile because different OSs store information differently. So we need to know the profile to perform further analysis on the sample. And we do that using the image info command. And as you can see in the image, the profile for our memory sample is Windows XP SP2 32-bit. And the next command we use is psxview, which lets us quickly view all running programs and if they're hidden. And malware will often attempt to hide itself and related processes. So this is a quick way to view suspicious processes.
Hi, my name is Nicole, and after the PSX view, we used a command of command scan, which tells you what commands were either previously typed in the command shell or through a network backdoor by an attacker. And as you can see, by using this command, we were able to see that there were two separate queries that did attempt to run an unknown service inside the terminal called malware through the CSRSS process, which is an indicator of a compromise. And later, we used command conscan, which displays ongoing networks or recently terminated connections on device. And using the principle of every contact leaves a trace, we're able to tell that the process ID of 1956, which corresponds to Explorer.exe, established connection with a remote IP address on port 6666. And by doing some minor OSINT, we were able to find that this is a private IP address instead of a public one that people normally use to connect to the internet. So that's a bit suspicious. And with the conscan, we used the command of IE history, which basically gives the cached history of Internet Explorer in order to find if there was any suspicious activity on the network that could have corresponded with the remote IP address that we saw on the previous slide. And by using this, we were able to find that there were two separate PDF files named exploit and listener that were previously accessed on this device. These are also the two files that we believe to have been the source of infection in this memory dump.
So my name is Songwon. So by running the PS3 command, we can see a list of running processes, and our team has recognized that the CMD executable file, which is the command line, is running under the Explorer executable, which we have previously identified as a malicious executable file. So this could be a sign of code execution and malicious injection. Next slide, please. And for those who are not familiar with DLL files, it is a collection of small programs that larger programs can load when they need to complete a specific task. So it could be very useful in the process of running the applications, but due to its characteristics, just by infecting a single DLL file, it could later lead to a DLL injection, which can alter the computer system and allow intruders to gain remote access to the system. And by running the DLL list command, we can see the list of all DLL files in the command executable, which is in process ID 544. And we're doing this because in the previous slides, we have seen the commands that were typed in the command shell. So we are analyzing the collection of DLL files to see if a suspicious activity has occurred or not. And as you can see in the screenshot, we recognize that the OX0000 base is very suspicious compared to other bases of DLL files. So we did lit of OSINT, where we gathered open source data and figured out that this DLL file is not recognized as a native Windows DLL files. And based on this research, we identified that the MFC42UL.dll file is likely conducting a DLL injection. Next slide, please. And in this section, we moved the list of detected instances of MFC42UL.dll files into the TMP directory so that we can analyze by using the MD5sum command to verify the integrity of a file. And as you can see in the screenshot, you can see the hash value of MFC42UL.dll. And now we take that hash value and search it on virustotal.com. As previously mentioned, it's a website where it analyzes and compares malware and viruses and hashes with known malicious databases. So by running this process, we figured out that the hash value is identified as a backdoor Trojan, which is R2D2.
Hi, my name is Romeo, and here we use the command yarscan. The function of this command is to search for the supplied string C3PO R2D2 POE inside the memory sample. We discovered that several processes seem to contain this string. Doing some open source intelligence, or OSINT, we found this string is commonly included in R2D2 payloads, which gave us a clue on the identity of the malware. After we use yarscan, we use the command modules. The modules command provides a list of modules and where they are located on the computer. WinSys32 is the only program loaded from C Windows and is recognized as a software component of a backdoor Trojan. It connects to a remote IRC server, which is essentially a system for instant messaging. It waits for commands from the remote user, activating an IRC client, which then provides the remote hacker access to the full system.
So besides I'm Alex, by the way. So besides looking at the modules, we can also look at the drivers in the memory sample using the commands driver scan and driver IRP. And driver IRP, the output of driver IRP, you can see on the picture that's labeled number 2. It's more in depth, but we can also see the WinSys32.sys that Romel just mentioned. Next slide, please. Yep. So if you remember from memory analysis, malwares like to put themselves inside the registry to make sure they run for longer and also like stay hidden from the system. And so using the command print key, we can see that the malware in this memory sample has also stored itself onto the registry. So overall, in this analysis, we found that there was a covert communication channel in use under explore.exe, which is running under the process ID of 1956. Additionally, we also found the WinSys32.sys malicious kernel driver. We also located the MFC42UL.dll file that was pretty suspicious and also flagged with R2D2 on VirusTotal. And then finally, with the appearance of the C3PO R2D2 POE string that we found using Yaroscan, the most likely culprit for the malware in this memory sample is the R2D2 Trojan. So the R2D2 Trojan is a type of malware that's meant to monitor internet conversations, capture screenshots, record keyboard actions, and download and execute arbitrary files. And one of its main purposes is to steal Skype credentials.
Awesome. So there's one question in the chat right now. Someone wants to know what drivers are in the memory sample.
I can take over the questions. My name is Carter. And I see the question, what are drivers in the memory sample? A driver is a specific set of files, a part of an operating system in a computer, and it tells the hardware side of the computer how to interact with the software side, which is in this case the Windows operating system itself. And multiple computers can have different sets of drivers and things, but for this one specifically, we were able to find a malicious driver that was installed onto this computer.
All right, that sounds great. That's all for now, so you guys can just keep going.
All right.
Hi, my name is Serena, and stage 3 of this project is focusing on open source intelligence for OSINT. A quick disclaimer before we start. All artifacts we are analyzing are all public artifacts that have already been analyzed by the cybersecurity community. This training data is publicly available, and all domains and IP addresses used may not be associated with a malicious malware previously analyzed. BWSI is not affiliated with and does not endorse any of these domains in any way. We suggest that these sources are not tampered with. Open source intelligence, or OSINT, is collected through publicly available information about an individual or an organization. For this capstone project, Stage 3 is focusing on conducting open source research to learn about the use of different tools in malware analysis, identify whether the malware infrastructure is live or still forming connections, and determine which group is responsible for the malware. Some of the tools that we use in our analysis are VirusTotal, AnyRun, Whois, Joe Sandbox, ThreatMiner, and DNS Dumpster. These open source resources allow us to analyze and determine critical information about the malware and its origins. The next slide shows the research process that we took to analyze the malware. First, we scanned the domains provided to us by the malware analysis team, or Stage 2A, to solve for malicious activities. From that, we will know suspicious and key information such as the IP address, hash, and user dates. We will use the IP address to try to determine the approximate infrastructure location. After finishing collecting all the information, we established some key facts that we know are true from our research. Using those key facts, we tie all the information together to form conclusions regarding the malware. Now we will go through our analysis for sample email using the research process explained in the previous slide. We were able to receive data from the malware analysis team, which included an email from the text file they extracted, as well as the header message ID. From the email, we were able to see who the sender is claiming to be, such as their name, company, and email. We ran this email address to VirusTotal and received reports that there were multiple security vendors flagging this email as either phishing or malware. From the VirusTotal scan, we were also able to find the serving IP address, which we will also be scanning later.
Using the message ID from the header we found, I was able to run it through AnyRun, which is a sandbox environment, which is basically an isolated testing environment that enables users to run programs without affecting the application. So through that and a VirusTotal scan, we were able to determine a DNS request to the domain DigiCert and 3 IP address connections. Investigating the first IP address connection using ThreatMiner, we were able to determine the location to be in Utah. However, the organization was still unknown. Investigating DigiCert, which was the domain we found, and learning that DigiCert, a public key infrastructure company, was based in Utah, we were able to infer that this IP address was being hosted by DigiCert server. Next, we investigated the second IP address connection using ThreatMiner once again to identify its location in Kansas and the organization, which is level 3 parent. We were also able to use AnyRun to correlate the IP address to Windows Update, which is a Microsoft service.
Hi, I'm Claire, and finally we ran the third IP through ThreatMiner, and we received the geolocation, which is in Massachusetts, the organization, and the registrant. And then we also ran this IP through DNS Dumpster, and we confirmed the organization, and we found that the certification was done by Microsoft. So then going back to the message ID we found in the email header, we ran it through Whois, which is another tool where we discovered that the email address and name servers, we discovered the email address, the address, and the name servers of this domain. Then we used URL House, which is a community database for sharing malicious URLs. We ran our domain that we found through our message ID as well as our IP address that's correlated with this domain through URL house. And then through this, we discovered that the IP address is still active, and there are multiple records of malware being linked to this IP in the past. So we see through our process that SpurEdge is a domain which sent a phishing email. Using our tools, we learned that there are DNS requests and IP addresses that link the domain to DigiCert, which is a public key company. We also learned that Microsoft Services also made a DNS request from a malicious IP connected to this domain. Also, a connected IP address is linked to a technology company with a Microsoft certificate. We learned that the malicious IP from this domain is still alive, and there is historical record of malware being linked to this domain. So in conclusion, we believe that the malware program is trying to use well-established services such as DigiCert and Microsoft to appear legitimate and test for connections through their infrastructure.
So next, we received a number of domains from Stage 2A, which was the malware analysis team. We ran each URL through VirusTotal, which was a platform that helped us determine how many security vendors were flagged for each URL. So as you can see on the list on the right, the URLs in green indicate that VirusTotal found no vendors in them, which means they're secure or clean. The domains in red text indicate that at least one security vendor was flagged, so that's marked as malicious. And the domains in purple text indicate that VirusTotal could not find any information on that domain. We next compiled a list of all the malicious links that allowed us to further research and look to see what was malicious about them. So the first domain we looked into, when we ran through VirusTotal, we found that there were 9 out of 94 security vendors flagged as malicious. We were also able to find the IP address from VirusTotal. Using the IP address, we ran it through ThreatMiner, which told us that the geolocation was indicated to be in Moscow, Russia. It also gave us the organization name of the IP address. We also ran that same IP address and IP info, but that showed us a different location in Nuremberg, Germany. The organization was the same for ThreatMiner and IP info. So we concluded that because of the two different locations for the same IP, that the company simply relocated the IP address, which makes it very difficult for us to find the exact location of the company. The next thing we did was run a different malicious IP address through ThreatMiner to find the geolocation, which was found to be in Missouri in the US. We ran that same malicious IP and IP info, and we found that the geolocation for that was in Los Angeles. We were also able to find the organization and host name for IP info. So you can see on the upper right, that was the location found in ThreatMiner, and on the bottom right was that IP info geolocation. So clearly, in this example, there are also different locations for the same IP address, which makes it very hard to find the exact real location for this malicious user.
Apologies, everyone.
Sorry for that, but using the domain we found from the previous tools, we were able to investigate further and find, using VirusTotal, it communicating with various Trojan files. We also were able to investigate another domain we found, which led us to another IP address and another domain, which also was flagged by many vendors and indicated ransomware.
Okay, so then we moved on to the second malicious IP address that we pulled from the AnyRun scan on the malicious domain. And so this IP address was determined to be malicious and located in Turkmenistan. We also determined that this IP address was in communication with several Russian malware domains. And we also conducted a ThreatMiner scan, which concluded that the IP address was based in Russia. Then we ran the third IP address that we gathered from the AnyRun scan on the malicious domain through VirusTotal, and we found that it was marked safe by several security vendors, but however was in communication with malicious software. Although we conducted further research to uncover more details regarding the intent of the IP address, there was nothing else we could find.
But we also conducted a threat miner analysis to conclude that the IP address belonged to an organization based in Iceland.
Hey, it's Amrita. So we ran through the malicious domain. We ran our malicious domain through AnyRun, and its analysis indicated that the file was most likely a Trojan malware, which downloaded executable files. Our Joe Sandbox analysis presented a suspicious screenshot from the site requesting the user for their Telegram information, and Telegram being a highly encrypted messaging platform that originated in Russia. Next slide. Our Whois analysis showed that the registrant was registered as private, which only furthered our suspicions on the file being malicious. The snapshot of the website showed that the website posed as a fake Telegram website, and the IP address revealed that the location was from Ukraine. We also ran the file through VirusTotal, which showed and confirmed that the hash file of the malware was malicious. Taking into our hard evidence and facts, we knew that our malware research reports indicated that the type of malware being downloaded was most likely Trojan malware. The fake Telegram website and private domain registration proved to be more suspicious. There were also several instances of Russian, German, and Polish transcript that allowed us to make an educated guess that the hacker was most likely based in Eastern Europe. Given the solid facts, we were also able to come to the conclusion that the threat was attempting to pose itself as Telegram in order to download Trojan malware into local devices.
My name is Nia, and I will be talking about the final domain found by the Group 2A malware analysis team, and that was digistart.com/CPFO. So we first ran it through VirusTotal, where 1 out of 87 security vendors flagged it as malicious or unsafe. Specifically, Safe to Open was flagged for phishing, and Katera was listed as suspicious. We were able to find the IP address and able to locate that the domain was communicating with 2 other malicious files, as seen in the screenshot. Next, we ran the IP address through Threat Miner and found that the geolocation was Delaware, United States. Next, we ran the original link through Whois domain tools to find additional info. First, we found the registrant as registration private domains by proxy located in Tempe, Arizona. It was created in 1996. It expires in 2026, and it was last updated in March of 2017. The registrar was GoDaddy.com, and we were able to find the IP address to be the same and located in Seattle, Washington. Through this process, we were able to establish key facts, including the VirusTotal determined that the URL could be a phishing attempt. It flagged Safe to Open, which is supposed to be protection against phishing, and Katera, which is supposed to be an online malware scanner. The Threat Miner scan was able to provide the IP address and the location as Delaware. Whois pointed the company to Seattle, Washington. And from further research, we were able to find DigiCert as a public key company and the organization as a cloud-based application delivery platform. Through an additional resource called Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agent, their malware report, we outlined the domain as a proxy server to intercept incoming firewall. We hypothesized that the URL is a phishing attempt that accesses a machine's firewall and allows incoming connections. We concluded that the malware disguised itself as a legitimate encrypted SSL session by utilizing well-known public SSL certificates.
Hi, I'm Portia, and I'll be talking about the last few slides. So one of the questions that we looked at is the infrastructure still alive? And when we ran this through VirusTotal, the program indicated that the malicious domains were still running. We also found the HTTP response code 200 status, which indicated that the request succeeded and the source had been fetched. And another question that we looked at was, which group may be responsible for this malware? So based on our findings, it is likely that the group is Nomadic Octopus, which is a Russian group that targets Central Asia. It spearfishes through emails, and it also matched our findings that it disguises itself as Telegram with Russian interface. Another possible malware that was involved is called Raccoon Stealer, which is a ransomware. So Raccoon Stealer was first observed in 2019 and advertised as a malware as a service threat. It is an information stealer targeting victim credentials in cryptocurrency wallets. Its implementation includes beginning with unsolicited emails to deliver malicious documents. It mimics other executables, and each payload communicates with benign / legitimate URLs from which an encrypted string is gathered and processed to obtain the true C2 URL. It communicates with websites offering Telegram URL shortening services, and it's rented out on cybercriminal forums.
So one question that came up was, how do you safely investigate malware?
Right, so we took a number of precautions. Oftentimes when we looked into it, we used a virtual machine. So we opened a different application, so we didn't have to actually look around with it on our actual computer. Another precaution we did was, instead of typing in the actual link, we would replace in the HTTP with X's, and we would add other symbols. So if someone accidentally clicked on the link, it wouldn't actually go anywhere because it had been modified.
Yeah, I think a tool which was really useful for us was AnyRun, which I explained earlier was kind of a sandbox tool, which basically isolated the domain you're investigating from your actual device. So that kind of added an extra layer of protection.
Awesome.
Great. We have another question, which is, will Microsoft revoke their certification if it is used unethically?
So something we want to clarify is that when we're saying that the malicious user was Microsoft, it wasn't actually Microsoft. It was a user pretending that they were Microsoft. So people would think it was safe when actually they were just using a cover up so people wouldn't find them malicious. So Microsoft was not tampering with anything.
I think specifically in this situation as well, the domain which has the Microsoft certificate was not in the wrong, but the malware was testing for connections through legitimate infrastructure, which makes it hard for us to determine which service providers are in the wrong.
Great, that was all the questions for this section, so you guys can keep going.
We will now be sharing some student experiences from our CyberOps course.
I worked stage. It was really good. We really collaborated together to inspect each file in Wireshark. Sometimes there was some internet or but we went past that and we just worked together and collaborated, which was probably one of the best parts. And we just worked together to filter out with the HTTP protocol, and that's how we discovered the four malicious IPs. And yeah, that was probably the best part, and I just really liked it because we just all worked together and we all implemented our own ideas to solve the problem as best as possible. Yeah, I'll pass it off to Johnny.
So hey everyone, my name is Johnny, and right now I'll kind of share my experiences in the CyberOps class, and specifically my experiences with Linux labs and practice environments that we took part in during the class. So we worked with the platform TryHackMe, and also my personal favorite, Over the Wire, kind of a capture the flag platform that teaches Linux and cybersecurity topics through working with services like SSH to find and locate a specific flag. We also kind of had the opportunity to work with industry-based skills, such as practicing and deploying a hands-on HTTPS website on AWS that supports TLS connections, and that was being supported by an Nginx server. So just these experiences and being able to gain hands-on industry practice, as well as being able to work in a team environment, was really critical to our future, and for me personally, just gaining more experience in this industry. So.
Hi, I'm Alex. Participating in the CyberOps course has been really interesting to me. Throughout the 4 weeks, I learned many aspects of cybersecurity, including the variety of tools used in the field. My favorite part of the course were the guest speakers who came in and gave us unique insight of their work, such as Tom Kopchak from Hurricane Labs, who walked us through the process of writing reports, and like Eric Kabelski from New Harbor, who introduced us to Mesploit, a tool used for penetration testing. My favorite speaker was Micah Hoffman, who gave us a captivating presentation about open source intelligence. And his presentation demonstrated how people can use and analyze public information from stuff even like social media, and in order to get a better understanding of their targets for all kinds of malicious purposes. So I've really found his presentation on open source intelligence interesting, and thanks to him and the other guest speakers, I was able to expand my understanding of cybersecurity as well as grow interest for the field.
Yeah, I also agree with Alexander. I thought that all the guest lecturers and our instructors and TAs, all the activities we did in the first half were very helpful and informative. And I think, especially with the OSINT, I enjoyed that so much. I decided to work in capstone in the OSINT group, where I was able to apply what I learned in the first 2 weeks, specifically with what Micah Hoffman taught us in the OSINT presentation he gave, and I was able to apply that in my own skills, and that really helped me understand that a lot more. And I was able to use hands-on like learning and draw conclusions and work with my teammates, and it was just a really great experience. And I thought it was a really good balance of lectures and learning and also applying the skills that we had used.
Yeah, Torin, I think what Ella mentioned, she basically mentioned everything. One of the speakers, which I really enjoyed, was talking about operations technologies and how cybersecurity is getting increasingly intertangled with hardware systems and supply chains, and how that will become increasingly important in the future. I think just the insight from all these guest lecturers about the importance of this field and how it will keep growing, but also the capstone experience, being able to work with everyone and just have a fun time. I think that was the biggest part.
Yeah, and I want to agree with Tor that hearing from all these guest speakers and professionals and how intertwined like cybersecurity is becoming with computers and networks and all that is like, I found it really interesting over this whole course. And one thing specifically that stuck with me is the number of tools that there are available to conduct network forensics, that is like checking for malicious activity like attackers or malware, or just checking general safety on a network. And it gave me a greater appreciation for the amount of work needed to interpret what's going on with all this technology, because there's so much happening at once. And having all of these tools available like Wireshark, T-Shark, Yara, Volatility as application tools, and then there's also online tools that are free as well, which is like there's Whois, Google Admin Toolbox, VirusTotal, AnyRun. Like, it's very encouraging to see the accessibility of these safety tools for the public. And then also when it comes to the professionals and guest speakers, I remember specifically there were two companies that were brought up. It was Suricata and Zeek, and we had professionals come in and speak for their products and services. I thought that was really cool because it showed not only the individuals who are creating tools, but also the professional applications and businesses and the need for these tools. And so overall, just the whole course, after hearing all these professionals' experiences with cybersecurity and working with all these different layers and all these different tools and putting it all together. It stuck with me in appreciating the level of detail needed for this field, and I've enjoyed it a lot. So it's been wonderful.
Are there any final questions from our audience, either about our research that we did for our presentation or just our general experience with the course? These are the sources that we referenced throughout our research, and that concludes our capstone presentation for the CyberOps course.
Class leader and class, thank you for your brief. You will get your grade at the you get the brief towards the end of the day. I'm not going to spoil it, the grade, yes or no, but we'll see. We'll see. Good luck. Yeah. Dismissed.